In a desolate land, where life remains only in the traces of the past, a widow named Sarah lives in solitude, her heart heavy with longing. She lost her husband in an Apache attack, and now, life consists only of long, monotonous days. But then, one day, as she prepares her last meal in her empty cabin, a severely wounded Apache warrior, KL, suddenly appears at her doorstep, bearing a fragile survival and secrets no one knows. Little does Sarah know, one act of mercy will forever change the fates of both of them, forcing them to face difficult choices. Can love bloom between them, one a settler and the other an enemy she once despised? Stay with me, for this story will make you reconsider forgiveness, love, and redemption in the most unexpected circumstances. Outside Sarah's small cabin window, the cold winds blow through the cracks of the leaves, carrying with them the misty air of a late autumn afternoon. To this day, for many months, Sarah has been unable to heal the pain of losing her husband. Everything around her reminds her of the past, of the warm moments spent with the man she loved the most. But now, there are only the cold winds and the relentless cries of insects in the dark night, her only companions in that small house. She no longer has family, no friends, only herself in this harsh frontier land. Day by day, Sarah struggles with the loneliness, tending to the small garden her husband had planted before his death, trying to maintain a self-sufficient life. Despite the harshness of the land, she persists, looking after herself, though at times, it feels as though she is a ghost in her own home. Yet in those moments of peace, no one knows that Sarah is facing a truth even more terrifying than the strong winds outside. She is slowly being consumed by loneliness and the fear that she will live this way forever, alone in a world that seems to have no place for her. On dark nights, when the evening falls and the fire in the stove begins to die down, Sarah sits alone by the window, gazing out into the vast emptiness, where there is nothing but the wild forest. She wonders if her life will continue this way, with no one by her side, no one to share in her joys, her sorrows, or even her dreams. These questions whirl in her mind, deepening the weariness and despair in her soul. Sarah has tried to forget the past, but it seems that the memories of her late husband always follow her, like a shadow she cannot shake. She loved him with all her heart, but now there is only emptiness. And then, at that moment, when she thought life had taken away everything of value, when all hope seemed to vanish, fate brought a stranger into her life. The sudden knock at the door broke the stillness of the cabin. Sarah could not believe her eyes when she saw the man standing at her door, an Apache warrior, someone she had only heard about in her husband's stories. He was lying motionless, severely wounded, and seemed to be on the verge of death. Sarah didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear: she could not let him die on her doorstep. Her compassion, an indelible part of her, made her act without thinking of the consequences. With everything she had, Sarah decided to save the man, despite the risks and dangers that might come with it. She cared for him, bandaged his wounds, fed him, and hid him from the suspicious eyes of those around her. She didn't know that this act would mark a turning point in her life, opening up a journey full of challenges, hardships, and lessons about love, forgiveness, and sacrifice. Sarah never thought her life would change in this way. A stranger, from a people she had always seen as enemies, would determine her future. But in that moment of mercy, a great change began to form within her. A change she could not have foreseen, story of redemption she had never imagined. As night fell, and the weak light from the oil lamp flickered in the empty cabin, Sarah sat by the window, as she did every night, looking out into the vast darkness, where nothing existed but the howling winds and the enveloping shadow. The feeling of loneliness clung to her like a shadow. She had become accustomed to the silence, but tonight was different. There was a change in the air, an unease she couldn't explain. From the darkness, the sound of a horse's whinny echoed to Sarah's ears, sending a chill down her spine. She stood up, walked to the door, pulling with her an odd sense of anxiety and dread. And then, in that moment of stillness, an unexpected sound broke the silence, the sudden footsteps on the hard ground. Sarah quickly opened the door, her heart pounding. Before her, a sight that made her heart ache. A man, tall and muscular, collapsed at the threshold of the cabin. Blood was oozing from his wounds, and his breath was weak, as if he were about to die. This man was no one else but an Apache warrior, those whom she had once heard about in her husband's stories, those who had always been considered enemies. Sarah didn't have time to think. She simply pulled him inside. Her heart was filled with fear, but she could not leave a man who was so close to death outside her door, especially when there was no one else around. She took care of him with all the caution and humanity she could muster, bandaging his wounds. Though her heart was full of confusion, she never imagined she would find herself in such a situation. Sarah now faced a difficult decision. Could she trust her own act of mercy, or was it simply an unavoidable decision made out of conscience and kindness, regardless of the prejudices and dangers that might come at any moment? When the Apache warrior awoke, he opened his eyes and looked around, clearly confused and exhausted. However, something unexpected happened. He didn't show hatred or hostility, as Sarah had been told the Apache were. He remained silent but conveyed gratitude through his eyes. Sarah began to realize that he wasn't the enemy, she thought, but a man also wounded, carrying his own pain. But she could not avoid the question in her heart. Was this man truly dangerous, or was he just trying to survive in a world full of enemies? Not long after, Sarah heard unfamiliar footsteps outside the cabin. She hurried to close the door, but the fear gripping her heart could not be stopped. The Apache hunters were coming closer. Sarah knew that if they were discovered, not only would the warrior be in danger, but she herself would be too. Reluctantly, she understood that she had to act immediately. With a heavy heart, Sarah faced a difficult decision. Protect him, even though he was an Apache warrior, part of the enemy in the eyes of many, or let him go and face the consequences, which were unpredictable. She wondered, would her kindness cost her too much? This question would haunt her, as with every passing minute, the danger grew nearer. The strange sounds outside became clearer. Sarah knew her fate had been completely changed. With no way out, she had to face the truth that her life had started to unravel with a simple decision to save a man she didn't even know. But this act of mercy would not only change his fate, but hers as well, in ways she never could have imagined. Sarah stood silently in the cabin, holding tightly to the blood-stained cloth, trying to bandage the man before her. For the past several hours, she couldn't help but feel the thread hanging over her head. The painful gaze of the Apache warrior, his deep black eyes seemingly holding a sorrowful story, made her heart ache. Though her help might change his life, she was also putting herself in a position of great danger. If discovered, the people around her would never forgive this act. She couldn't help but think about the confrontation she would face if rumors about an Apache warrior surviving in the area spread. The fear intensified as the footsteps drew nearer. She knew if the locals found out he was hiding in her cabin, the consequences would not only affect her, but threaten the entire community. In a society full of division and hatred, a widow like her had no other choice but to act. At that moment, Kale, the Apache warrior, silently woke, his gaze meeting hers with silent gratitude. He clearly understood the situation. Though he had once fought to survive, now he had no choice but to rely on Sarah's help. In that moment, when he was close to death, he saw life in an unexpected placid, lonely widow in a cabin, someone who could save him from death. But nothing was as simple as it seemed. Sarah knew that, while she saved him, she was placing herself in greater danger than ever before. They were not only trying to escape the pursuit of Kale's enemies, but also facing judgment from the very people Sarah had once trusted. Those who lived around this area had long viewed the Apache as enemies, and she couldn't fathom their anger if they learned she was helping one. In the silence, Sarah couldn't shake the weight of the responsibility pressing on her. If she let Cale go, he would surely die, and she would live with that haunting memory. But if she kept him, their lives would both be in jeopardy. She had to choose between saving a desperate soul or preserving her own safety. In that moment, Sarah felt that, no matter what she did, there would be no perfect choice. Her compassion wouldn't allow her to abandon Cale, but it couldn't ease the growing fear inside her. Redemption doesn't only come from actions, it also comes from facing the challenges fate places in front of you. She couldn't save the whole world, but in this moment, she could save one person. She could choose to act according to her conscience, but that choice wouldn't be easy. Over the following days, Sarah's life was no longer the peaceful routine it once was. Though she had saved Cale, the Apache warrior was still part of the world she had always tried to avoid. Yet, now, he had become an inseparable part of her life, one she couldn't simply erase or forget. This unexpected situation had pulled Sarah into a new life, one she hadn't wanted. Cale, with his wounds slowly healing, still couldn't leave immediately. This wasn't only because of his physical weakness, but for a deeper reason. He needed time to hide from his pursuers. But as the days went on, Sarah did not anticipate that her marriage to Cale would become an unchangeable truth, a truth she hadn't prepared for. As the villagers began to notice Sarah's absence and inquire about her, their attention began to shift toward Cale. The questioning glances, the strange questions, could no longer be easily ignored. One morning, when the women in the village came to visit, they could no longer hide their suspicion about Cale's presence in Sarah's house. Although no one spoke it aloud, the silence was enough for Sarah to understand that she could no longer keep this secret for long. Nothing remains hidden forever, it would eventually be discovered. The situation forced her into a corner, and the choice became clearer than ever. If she didn't marry Cale, both of them would be expelled from the community, pushed outside the rules of society. But if she agreed, she would have to accept a new life, one not only different in cultural background but also full of inner struggles. Could she maintain her dignity and honor in this society by marrying an Apache warrior? Her marriage to Cale was not one based on love or voluntary choice, but rather a temporary salvation, a step to survive in a world where the boundaries between friends and enemies were blurred. The wedding day approached, and Sarah felt herself being pushed into a situation from which she couldn't escape. Thoughts of her late husband, memories of the happy days they once shared, were now buried in dark days full of uncertainty. Cale, though a strong Apache warrior, was, to Sarah, just a man filled with pain, someone life had forced into a situation no one could understand. He wasn't the man she wanted, but her salvation couldn't be measured by personal feelings. After all, he was the one she had to share her life with, the one she had to face every day. On the wedding day, Sarah didn't feel romantic emotions, but an emptiness, a feeling she couldn't fill. Everything seemed to be beyond her control. She couldn't admit that this marriage would change everything from the outside world to her own life. People would look at her differently, and that made Sarah feel as though she had been stripped of every layer of her self-respect. She couldn't change the past, but she was forced to accept a present she never wanted. Cale, during this time, never pressured her. He remained silent, always understanding that Sarah did not want to marry him, but he had no other choice. He knew better than anyone that love might not be what they needed at that moment's survival. Living in this world was what mattered most. But for Sarah, the big question still lingered. Could she love this man, or was she just living a life she never chose? Day by day, the tension in their marriage grew. The relationship between Sarah and Cale gradually shifted from reluctance to understanding, but it was undeniable that, despite the sharing and empathy, they still couldn't overcome the large gap between their two worlds, the world of a widow and that of an Apache warrior, two people from vastly different backgrounds. trying to find common ground in a world full of pain and trials. The tension in Sarah and Cale's marriage gradually became unsustainable. Although they had lived together for a long time, each day brought their differences more clearly into view. Sarah began to realize that this marriage was not just a bond between two people from different worlds, but also a great test for her heart and soul. Each morning, as she saw Cale working in the garden, tending to the land she had known for so long, she felt that what she saw before her was not the husband she had once imagined. Sarah had hoped that, as time passed, some form of affection might blossom between them, a deep connection that could heal the wounds of the past. But the reality was quite different. Cale, though the man she had saved, still carried secrets she could not understand. He always kept a distance, never speaking much about his past, the wars he had fought in, the pain he had endured. Although he said nothing, his thoughtful glances made Sarah feel that he was unreachable, a wall that had always existed between them. One evening, when night had fallen and only the sound of the wind rustled through the branches outside, Cale sat across from Sarah, his gaze fixed on the flames in the stove, as if searching for something in the fire itself. Sarah, despite not wanting to, couldn't suppress the growing sense of unease inside her. She clearly felt that deep in her heart, the struggle and conflict had never been greater. Unexpectedly, Cale spoke, his voice low and heavy. "Have you ever wondered why I can't love you, Sarah?" He paused for a moment, letting his question echo in the still air. Sarah looked up at him, and an indescribable feeling welled up in her heart. She had thought about this many times, but never dared to ask him directly. She smiled faintly, but her answer wasn't a denial, it was a painful truth. "We can't love each other, Cale." "That's something I've known for a long time," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We're too different. I am of this land, and you. You are of war and hatred. We can't live in the same world without pain." Cale didn't respond immediately, but his gaze made Sarah realize that he had heard every word she said. What she uttered was not a judgment, but an acknowledgement of a truth neither of them wanted to face. Cale hadn't found love in Sarah, and Sarah couldn't love him the way she had hoped. They had married out of necessity, but now their existence together was only an evasion of both their pains. Even as they sat together in silence, their hearts were struggling to heal old wounds. Sarah felt Cale's pain as he quietly stared at the fire, as if everything from his past was burning him at that moment. She realized that it wasn't that Cale didn't love her, but rather that he didn't know how to love because he had lived too long in war and hostility. He didn't know what to do to overcome those pains. The next day, Sarah went out into the garden, where Cale was working, holding a hoe. She stood there for a moment, watching him, sensing a great change in her heart. Although she could not love him as a real husband, the empathy and sharing between them had gradually begun to. They didn't need to say much, just the quiet understanding in each other's actions. But in Sarah's heart, there still remained a large, unanswered question. Could they continue living together, not out of duty or survival, but for something real? Or would they always be two lost people, living beside each other in an irremovable loneliness? That question remained unanswered, but Sarah knew that only time could provide the answer. From that challenging moment on, when Sarah and Cale looked at each other and acknowledged that love could not naturally bloom between them, a small change began to take root in each of their souls. Though there were no declarations of love or romantic gestures, in the silence, in the mornings spent working together in the garden, or the quiet evenings by the fire, they began to form a different kind of relationship, a relationship not based on initial love, but on deep understanding and empathy. Cale, the man who had once been deeply wounded, was no longer the cold warrior Sarah had to fear. He began to open up, no longer keeping secrets about his past. Stories of battles, of painful days in the life of an Apache warrior, began to flow from him, not out of obligation, but because he felt the safety and understanding in Sarah's gaze. And Sarah, once a lonely widow, learned to see the man before her not as the enemy, but as a man of empathy, someone who had survived much pain just like her. They were no longer just two people living together out of necessity, but had gradually become two people sharing their lives. In times of hardship, they found comfort in one another. Both had learned to integrate into their shared life. Though they had not yet fully overcome the invisible walls between them, at least they no longer felt the same distance and unfamiliarity they once did. Those small moments, those simple gestures like when Cale fixed the roof, or when Sarah cooked him a meal after a long day, gradually created a strong foundation for a marriage neither had anticipated. However, the sincerity in their marriage wasn't easy. Kyle still had to fight with his past, with the images of war and hatred that had become deeply embedded in his mind. The nights when he couldn't sleep, the nightmares of battles and lost comrades, still haunted him. Sarah saw all of this, and instead of ignoring it, she chose to empathize and listen. Though she couldn't change Kyle's past, she could help him overcome his present pains. For Sarah, life with Cale was no longer a burden, but a journey to discover herself. She realized that, though they couldn't love each other immediately, they had learned to respect and care for each other in their own way. This was a great change, as Sarah had once believed that only love could sustain a relationship. But now, she understood that love didn't always have to come from passion, or sweet vows it could sometimes come from respect, sharing, and the moments spent together in silence. Day by day, Cale and Sarah began to build a life full of hope. The meals they prepared together, the hours spent working in the garden, and the quiet evenings were all small but precious moments that gradually made them a family, not in the traditional way they had once envisioned, but in their own way. Their bond wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. They both had their wounds and pains that no one could erase. But in those moments, through empathy and sharing, they had learned to heal each other's wounds. Cale was no longer the hardened warrior, but a man who knew how to love, how to share. And Sarah, no longer a quiet widow, was a wife with real affection, not fiery love, but a steady love, built on respect and understanding. Finally, they were able to look at each other without feeling the distance between them. It wasn't an instant change, but a gradual one, through small actions, gentle words, and warm touches. Their relationship had become a testament to the fact that love doesn't always have to come from perfection, but sometimes it comes from the wounds that have been healed, from people who have learned to overcome themselves to find happiness. Though Sarah and Cale's life had never been easy, now they could look at each other without the awkwardness or doubt they once felt. The days they spent together, enduring many trials and changes, had helped them realize that love doesn't always come from intense initial emotions but can be built through empathy, understanding, and simple gestures of care. Their relationship wasn't perfect as society expects, but it was a wonderful harmony between two different people, each carrying deep wounds, yet together finding a way to heal. Together, they transformed the small cabin where Sarah had once lived in loneliness into a real home. They were no longer just a widow and an Apache warrior, but a family. The late-night conversations by the fire, the meals prepared in silence but full of love, had become an indispensable part of their lives. Though the wounds of the past couldn't completely vanish, the present moments helped them step out of the shadow of pain and into the light of peace and happiness. Sarah understood that Cale was not a warrior from distant battles, as she had heard about. He was a man who had endured much loss, a man whose life had forced him to become part of a war he didn't choose. Cale also understood that, though he had saved her, love between them couldn't be forced. It had to grow from respect and friendship. They hadn't loved each other from the start, but now they had learned to love each other in their own way, a love built on sharing, understanding, and quiet actions. When their life together became stable, they began to realize that the future wouldn't be easy, but at least they would no longer be walking alone. Sarah was no longer a lonely widow, and Cale was no longer a warrior haunted by his past. They had learned to face hardships, not with strength or combat, but with gentleness, patience, and a willingness to open their hearts. They weren't perfect, but they had found a perfection in their relationship, a perfection born of unconditional love. Stepping into a new chapter of life, Sarah and Cale began to rebuild not only their material lives, but their spiritual lives as well. They no longer felt the divide between their different worlds. Instead, they had created a shared life, where each day was an opportunity to love and accompany each other. No more doubt or fear. They looked to the future with the belief that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. In the end, their story was not just about a widow saving a warrior, but about two people who found each other in the harshest circumstances, who changed and healed each other. They prove that no matter where you come from, no matter how many trials you faced in the past, love and resilience will always find a way to build a new future.